The name of this webinar is Subrogating Against God. I did have some feedback recently in the form of several emails and even a phone call from some people who were respectfully voicing their opinion that they felt the title of this seminar was disrespectful or even irreverent. This was both encouraging and a little surprising to me. Encouraging because it's refreshing to see people stand up for their faith and protect something that they value, but surprising a little bit because the title of the webinar has been the title of a series of articles that were first published nationally back in 2002, as well as a series of lectures that were given across the country by myself and one of the world's leading hydrologists and hydraulics experts. None of the articles nor any of those lectures produced similar feedback, but this webinar did, which I think is a testament to technology and reaching people in mass, as well as the ease of providing feedback by email. I didn't mind it at all. In fact, I enjoyed the feedback, but I'll just simply tell the audience this morning what I told those who emailed and called me. The title of the webinar is extremely telling in terms of the content when we talk about an act of God defense. Those who know me know that the last thing I would be is disrespectful when it comes to my faith. As a Christian, I'm often amused, if you will, at the efforts of mankind to outthink, second-guess, and marginalize God and the very powers of nature that God has put in place on earth. God visits hurricanes, windstorms, lightning, tornadoes, and floods upon man, and there isn't much that we can do about that. So the concept of subrogating against God is a tongue-in-cheek reference to the obvious futility in such a recovery effort where God is the primary cause of damage, i.e. a hurricane comes and wipes out a building. But as a subrogation professionals, we have to focus on the actions of man, man-made structures, construction, things that man does which exacerbate, worsen, or magnify a natural disaster, which is known as an act of God. So this seminar's goal is to train and heighten the awareness of the property subrogation professional so that we learn to unearth and recognize the negligent acts of someone or something against whom we can serve a summons and complaint, conduct discovery, and eventually obtain a full recovery. So the words against God are really a play on words relating to the nemesis of natural disaster subrogation, which is the act of God defense. And we'll get into that in some detail. In the last 30 years, there have been 96 weather-related disasters in our country which resulted in damages of over $1 billion. 96 weather-related events, each of which resulted in damages of over $1 billion. The top 3 subrogation recoveries that we've ever witnessed with our firm, and they've all been mid-7-figure recoveries, have all been weather-related. There's a natural assumption that when we have a weather-related catastrophe, lightning, windstorms, hurricanes, floods, which visit us, that the act of God defense applies. And if you're a defense lawyer or a liability adjuster, naturally and presumably you would default to the act of God explanation as to what happened, because you're trying to limit liability. But in the subrogation world, we are plaintiffs' lawyers. As bad as that may sound, we are trial lawyers for the insurance industry. We must think and act like trial lawyers. Subrogation professionals, when you take off your claims hat and put on your subrogation hat, we have to stop thinking about defenses and start thinking about causes of action, because an act of God is really an event that's caused solely by the effect of nature or natural causes without any interference by humans whatsoever. And that's a mouthful. It has to be attended to by circumstances which no human foresight could have prevented. And that leaves a very large door through which we can walk. When we have an act of God which destroys property, it's up to us to find potential third parties, to find liability, and to go out with the pointy edge of the subrogation sword and make a recovery. Now, the quote from JFK, which is on the screen, I've used this in webinars and seminars in the past, and I always disclaim it with the following, that it really is an urban legend. Although JFK did say this, by the way, he also said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," when he was talking in Berlin, which means I'm a jelly donut. Ich bin Berliner means I'm from Berlin. So he made a faux pas there as well. But the adage or urban legend that when written in Chinese, the word crises is composed of two characters, one representing danger and the other representing opportunity, is just too apropos for me to ignore, although I just have to tell you that it's not technically correct. If you can talk to anybody who's familiar with the Chinese language, in Mandarin it does not. Those two symbols do not represent both danger and opportunity. It's a little bit different, but it's instructive for our purposes, and this is how we have to think of crises and danger. We have to look at natural disasters as an opportunity, and I think what's significant is that we have to turn these crises into opportunity, and it requires investment on our part. Subrogation, be it work comp, health, property, auto, it requires an investment. In these tight times, I think we try to tightrope sort of stingily our subrogation efforts when in fact it may be the best investment out there right now in terms of the insurance industry. So the illusion is that natural disasters are often difficult to recover from, but the truth is that there's often potential out there that I think we just haven't taken the time to look into. So when we talk about natural disasters now, we're going to talk during this hour about the following: hurricanes, floods, wildstorms, hailstorms, ice storms, windstorms, sandstorms, and lightning. And the mixture of the two. When you have hurricane level winds that lift the roof off of a building, and that roof travels and lands on top of another structure and damages it, who is to blame? The people who constructed the building, or the act of God in terms of the high winds? I remind everybody that in our industry we have a disability, and that disability is a sort of a legal myopia, where we are short-sighted when it comes to recognizing liability because we have been trained to limit liability. As an industry, we have been had it drilled into our heads that just about every claim is frivolous, that there's always an explanation, that if someone's hurt or is damaged, it's usually their fault. And that's a healthy outlook if you're on the liability side of things. But those of us who have to then take off that cap and adjust a subrogation claim must put on the new cap of that of being a trial lawyer. You have to be somewhat creative and aggressive when it comes to natural disasters. And things aren't always what they seem. We're going to talk a lot today about floods because it's probably it's clearly the primary source of damage. Whether you insure automobile dealerships, auto auctions, I'll have several anecdotal stories about recoveries that we made and how we went about making them to illustrate some of the things that you can do when one of these natural disasters visits one of your insureds. But everything isn't what you or how it first appears when it comes to natural disasters. A quick story is in order. There was an Amish man and his 15-year-old son who visited the mall, the shopping mall, for the very first time. And as they walked through the mall, this Amish man and his 15-year-old son were amazed by everything they saw, the shops and the lights and the escalators. But one thing in particular captured their attention. There were two shiny silver walls that could move apart and slide back together. And the son and the father stared at it, and finally the son asked, "What is this, Father?" And the father, never having seen an elevator before, responded, "I've never seen anything like it." Just then an old lady in a wheelchair moved up to the moving walls and pressed the button. The walls opened up and she rolled inside. The walls closed, enclosing her in behind the walls, and numbers lit up sequentially. And when they reached the last number, then they began down in reverse order, and finally the walls opened up, and a beautiful 25-year-old blonde walked out. Now, the father, not taking his eyes off of the young woman, quietly leaned down and said to his son, "Go get your mother." And then the idea here behind the story is that you don't often know what you get, what goes on behind those silver doors, until you take the time and the investment to do the research. We're all familiar with Hurricane Katrina. Last November, a U.S. District Court in Louisiana, holding a bench trial for five flood victims, found the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers liable for $719,000 in damages for failure to properly maintain and operate a navigation channel. They found that there was a breach of one of the levees that contributed to the flooding. Although they didn't cause the flood, they did make it worse. And I want to repeat that. Although the engineers, the Army Corps of Engineers, actions did not cause the flooding, they did exacerbate it, and that is an actionable cause when dealing with a natural disaster. In particular, there's a Mississippi River Gulf outlet, which is a 76-mile man-made ship navigation channel near New Orleans, known by the acronym MRGO. This channel connects the Gulf of Mexico to the Port of New Orleans and also to the inner harbor of the navigation channel. And the surface width of this channel was wider than the bottom width, and therefore it acted through the laws of physics as a funnel for any storm surges. In addition, the salt water killed off the sort of storm-slowing plants that normally would be in there, and the Army Corps of Engineers was held to have, should have known that that was the case. So their inactions, although they couldn't by law be liable for the breach of the levees because they have sovereign immunity as a federal entity, they were held to be liable for the bad design of the MRGO. And there were two claims, the first claim being the levee breaches and the second claim being the design of the MRGO. The federal judge says, no, you can't be liable for claim one, but you can be liable for claim two, and he held them liable. So the point here is that even when you have a natural disaster of epic proportion with political overtones, the type of which we've never seen, there is subrogation potential. And I think that's significant. So as we talk today about natural disasters, we'll be hitting heavily on floods, but understand that even with windstorms, you can have situations where high winds come down and take rock and pea gravel off of the roof of a large 10, 12-story bank building. This is an actual case in Kentucky, and carry that gravel quite some distance to the surfaces of cars sitting in an automobile lot at a dealership, and causing a great deal of extensive damage. Those of you who have had hail damage and have seen your car while it's being repaired, it looks like it's been blown up. They've got to take all of the metal off, and so all of these cars had extensive repairs. And 50, 55-mile-an-hour winds, the defense, of course, claimed act of God. But when we did a little bit of digging, and here's where the investment comes in, a little bit of digging, we found out that this building had been recently re-roofed. And on a flat roof in a building of this nature, one of the methods is to lay down tar and then put gravel over it and work the gravel into the tar. But what they did with the old gravel is they just dumped it down one level and spread it out onto another portion of the building, but they didn't secure the gravel. So even a 30-mile-an-hour wind, our expert testified, would have taken some of that gravel and whipped it over on top of the vehicles. So we were able to make a nice recovery against the company who did the roofing on that building. Now the big defense is, well, gravel comes from everywhere. You've got 50-mile-an-hour winds. That gravel is going to be coming from all over. But our defense here was that we looked at the actual gravel, and you can trace. We had to get a gemologist and a rock expert to come in and actually testify that these rocks all came from the same quarry, the gravel that was on the top of this building. And it wasn't gravel from any other building that was causing the problem. So you can see that science plays a big role, and the use of experts, as we'll talk about later, play a big role. Lightning, I want to believe we have an article that's recently been out in one of our newsletters that talk about the fact that you can have lightning arresters and Preventing lightning from striking and causing damage is a science that has grown exponentially in the last few years, and there are steps that can be taken. Anywhere in the world there are some 30,000 lightning strikes at any one moment. You can literally be guaranteed that there's going to be lightning near one of your insured's concerns. So that's we'll be talking about all of these. And California wildfires, the New Mexico wildfires, those are all subrogable instances in which we can possibly make recoveries. So when we talk about weather-related catastrophes, we're talking about something that is an annual certainty. It's not always for certain that a product is going to blow up or start on fire or that your insured's going to drive off a bridge. But with absolute certainty, we can tell that there are going to be weather-related catastrophes. The question is not if, but when they occur. And unlike other areas of subrogation that we may be used to, subrogation potential is pretty well hidden when it comes to weather-related catastrophes. Mining subrogation potential is not easy like it is in certain claims. You need prompt action. You've got to get to a scene quickly. I know there are some clients attending today, and by the way, we have an excellent turnout. We have over 230 registered users, and I happen to know that about a dozen of those are conference rooms, which clients are filling up. So we have a great attendance today. So we need to have prompt action, all of us, when we have weather-related catastrophes. Again, think about the investigation and the investment that is needed when you have one of these losses. Notice has to be given. In some cases, the city of Austin, Texas, requires 30 days notice. Think about how fast 30 days goes by when you have a claim, and how often I have to tell someone, oh, I'm sorry, if you had gotten this to me earlier than 8 months after the loss, here's some things we could have done. But we can't, unfortunately, because as we all know, unlike wine, subrogation files do not get better with time. We have to get the right expert. And unfortunately, and this is why I emphasize investment, most often we're going to need an expert to tell us whether or not flooding was due to a man-made event or simply the rain which fell on a given watershed. I'll have some examples and some maps to show you in a little bit. But these are some of the things that we have to face, that hiring an expert, hiring subrogation counsel, or hiring both are a decision that has to be made based on the amount of loss. If your reserves or potential reserves are significant, I would not hesitate to get both subrogation counsel and an expert involved to determine if there is subrogation potential. If there's a flood loss, you have to look for things. You look for the difference between rainfall and the rise in the water, flooding in one area and not in another, obstructions in waterways. We'll have examples and photographs of those in a minute as well. But these are things where within a matter of days after a flood loss, evidence disappears. We'll talk later about one of the biggest flood recoveries we've ever had. And the thing that really won it for us was going out and in about a 2 square mile area, visiting businesses and taking a look within a week after the flood at watermarks on the building. I was there with a surveyor and an expert hydrologist, and they took laser sighting shots of the water lines and photographs, and were able to compile a computer program that detailed precisely what happened. Even though it happened at night, there were no witnesses and there was no security cameras or photographs. So rebuilding and reconstructing is key. When we talk about experts, getting the right expert, we can talk about the field of hydrology. If you're talking about floods, hydrology is the study of the movement and distribution of water. We can talk about a hydraulics expert, which has to do with the mechanical properties of water, watershed hydrology, river and plain hydraulics, pipe flow, river channel behavior. River channel behavior, that's what I was talking about with regard to Katrina. That's precisely what the expert pinned on the Army Corps of Engineers. Erosion, plants. You can get into horticulture, whereby certain plants are saltwater resistant, some aren't. In some cases, the growth of plants can actually cause something called the N value, which is the obstruction value of a known culvert, to be decreased by as much as 75%. And all it took was just adding a few chemicals to clean out some of that vegetation and sedimentation, and presto, you don't have a flood, whereas now you do. Inspecting streams nearby, mathematical models. I mean, all of this is necessary to identify potential defendants, like government entities, municipalities, counties, cities, states. One of the anecdotal stories we'll talk about is a nice recovery we made against the state of California, the county of Alameda, and the city of Hayward, California, at a time when Governor Gray Davis was in charge there, and they were in dire straits, even almost as bad as they are now. So to recover nearly $3 million from those government entities took quite a bit of arm twisting, but we did do it. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Contractors, engineers, railroads, highway departments, Army Corps of Engineers, these are all potential defendants that we need to be looking for in the instance of a flood loss such as that. Now, I want to go to turn the clock back to the year of 1993. This was a year which visited upon us an act of God. It was the unprecedented rainfall in the upper Mississippi River Basin. It is and was and still is the worst natural disaster in the U.S. ever. Now you're going, wait a second, what about Katrina? Notice I said natural disaster. This was a disaster which was caused by excessive rain and the banks of the Mississippi naturally overflowing. When we talk about Katrina, we're talking about, devastation to a city which was the result of man-made structures failing. And so what really wasn't a natural disaster as much as it was man making an act of God worse. So again, the distinction is important, but the worst natural disaster ever occurred, $15 billion in damages, 50 people were killed, hundreds of levees were destroyed, although they didn't cause the flooding. In many cases, thousands were evacuated. In our flood, the one that was sent to us by Commercial Union Insurance Company, about half a dozen syndicates with the Lloyd's of London, and a couple of insurers in the London market, was in the middle of it all. This involved 1,300 brand new Subarus that were parked in a quote-unquote storage facility in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Subaru had damages of over $11 million as a result of that loss. This loss occurred in the middle of the night as rains began to fall and the water began to rise. There was a piece of property that was owned by Chicago Northwestern Railroad. Chicago Northwestern Railroad wasn't doing that well. They put on their car storage hat and went and puffed and sold themselves to Subaru as, hey, I've got a great place for you to store cars, as a drop-off point on their way out to the west. So from Indiana, Cherry Hill, Subaru's in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, but from Indiana, which was their main production spot, trains would bring them to this location. They would store thousands of cars here, and then they'd be distributed from here, their central distribution point, to the west, to all the dealerships out there. Well, as the cars began to go underwater, the water level on the majority of cars got above the front windshield, and on all of the cars at least got to the floorboard. Now in the Subaru design of that year, all of the electronics, the ABS modules, all of the electronics were located on the floorboard, so those were all wasted. And they had something called the caterpillar effect, where water would creep up the wires and got into the behind the dash. The bottom line is most of the cars had to be crushed. Subaru has a policy that they will not sell water-damaged cars, even if they're refurbished, even if they spend $12,000 to make them run well and look good and smell good. They're not going to sell the vehicles for fear that they'll have some sort of a problem later on down the road. And those of you who are in the car industry or the dealership industry know that this is a common problem. Another common problem is, of course, that if we crush a $14,000, $15,000 car, the defense is going to claim, in addition to act of God, hey, why did you crush that car when all you had to do was put $7,000 into it and you could have resold it? So one of the arguments we had to make was, well, that's true, but a refurbished flooded car isn't worth what it used to be. There's a loss of use, loss of value, a diminution in value as a result of the flooding, and the policies of Subaru prohibit them. So this was a damage which was visited upon Subaru as a result of the floods. This large piece of property that you see was owned by Chicago Northwestern, but the Wackenhut security was on duty here, and we actually had a neighbor who said that they saw Wackenhut driving quickly up and down the rows in their Jeeps, causing a wake, which would then, of course, cause more damage to the cars. And they failed to move the cars when they knew they should have moved them when the water began to rise. So the investigation, and I'm going to, i.e. investment that we put into this case was Lloyd's of London. I was out there doing a file review for them, and they said, hey, what about this file? We spent a lot of money on this. And I said, well, let's do the following. Give me $50,000, and I'm going to go hire some hydrologists and some surveyors. I'm going to do a topographic survey, get a legal history, interview some witnesses, and let's see if we can't find some subrogation potential. In about 2 months, we were able to obtain all of the contracts. We actually located a contract by which Chicago Northwestern Railroad assured Subaru that water would not rise more than 2 inches at any one time. We discovered through a great deal of painstaking, I sat at the Kenosha News pouring through decades of newspapers looking for anecdotes, and it was discovered that the property that these vehicles were on, which you see here, and you can see the railroad spur up in the upper middle portion there, this was actually, everything you see in white was a farm field that was in a floodplain. It was in a 50-year floodplain, and they had brought in tons and tons and thousands of yards of gravel in order to make this into a car storage facility, which they could then package and sell to someone like Subaru as being a safe place to store the cars. Well, as it turned out, we were having a hard time finding out that this was in a floodplain, because this used to be the old American Motors Corporation storage facility, and the records didn't even go back that far, and they had disturbed the topography to a point where even the official records didn't show it being a floodplain. So we had to show by anecdotal evidence that it was a floodplain. And what do I mean by that? You can see, I'm going to try something a little fancy here. You can see up here in the middle where I put the green arrow, up here is a homestead and a farm. Over here is a small business. Over here are some folks that would be driving to work early that morning. And more importantly, down here in the bottom is a farm that's been in that family's possession for the last 150 years. And while we hired meteorologists and we went to get airport records on rainfall, but we had to show how much rain fell and why this area that you see in white flooded. And as it turned out, it took one visit where I sat and talked to an 89-year-old man and his wife, and they baked me a pie, and I sat where that green arrow is pointing in this house right here. And as he brought out decade after decade of notebooks in which he had copiously and tediously recorded rainfall on a half a dozen locations on his property, he then showed me some photographs that he had taken on the night of the rain of this, which is a culvert. What you see here and here is a swale, a natural swale, in which they had built some concrete culverts here that allowed water to flow under State Highway 50 here in Wisconsin. and we were able to prove that that was clogged. We were able to prove the rainfall, and then this entire piece of property here we were able to show was actually in a floodplain, and that combined with the contract that we found really went a long way to helping us obtain a settlement. The result of our hard work and the investment, of course, for Subaru was over $7 million. And what was really personally satisfying about this recovery, although it took a while, was for a $50,000 investment. Commercial Union and the London underwriters got a majority of their money back, and they also got, I put them back together with Subaru, who had 2 claims back-to-back, and they had canceled Subaru, and Subaru ended up going with a U.S. insurer who was charging about 40% more, and so it was a remarriage of Subaru and their insurers in the London market. So that was a kind of a happy ending. Now let's fast forward to 1998. I talked a little bit about this. Alameda, in 1998, there was a 100-year storm. Now that is an act of God. A 100-year storm means there's a 1% chance that you're going to have this storm. Technically, it doesn't mean that it's going to occur every 100 years, but that gets into a little bit of meteorology that we'll talk briefly about in a moment. The Bay Cities Auto Auction, owned by Cox Enterprises, a huge auto auction magnate out of Atlanta. There were 60 acres surrounded by storm channels. These are man-made culverts in a highly dense area near Hayward, California, which is just on the east side of the San Francisco Bay. And these storm channels and culverts ran west, eventually emptying into the bay. But it sits in a 100-year floodplain, and they had designed this storm drainage system to a 15-year standard. That means that anything larger than a 15-year storm, technically, it shouldn't be able to handle. Well, we were able to prove that despite there being a 100-year storm, because of the urbanization of the area, because of the man-made water channels and stormwater science that had been employed there, that the effect on our property, this 60 acres on which the Bay Cities Auto Auction stood, and it was filled with vehicles ready for an auction the next day. There were over 1,000 vehicles that were seriously damaged, over 2,200 that received damage to a total of $4 million. We were able to show that the levees were neglected. There was negligent design by the government now, and we were able to show that these storm channels had accrued sediment and vegetation to the point where their capacity was reduced from a 15-year storm to a 2-year storm. And our experts, who were extremely well-respected, and in fact, one of our experts was the brother, the grandson of Albert Einstein. Anyway, his last name was Einstein, which really plays well to a jury. But we were able to show that it was the negligence of the state of California in the county of Alameda and the city of Hayward, which led to the flooding of these vehicles. And in this case, we tried something a little different. We can't do this against private entities like the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, but we basically showed that the state of California had been guilty of inverse condemnation. This is a deprivation of property rights by the government. I mean, you've heard this term before, inverse condemnation. Out east, they took someone's private residence and turned it into a public facility, and there was a great deal of outcry with private property rights. But if you have a negligent plan of maintenance, not just negligent maintenance in California, if there is a physical, invasive, excessive regulation or taking of property, and in this case we showed that was the case because instead of taking the expensive route, which would have protected our insured 60 acres by boring under the Santa Monica Freeway or the 101 there. Instead, they made a 90-degree angle right-hand turn and then went west to the San Francisco Bay. But that 90-degree turn occurred right next to our client's property. So we were able to show that this turn, and water doesn't signal and make a right-hand turn like you and I do when driving. It wants to go straight. Water doesn't turn at a 90-degree angle very well, and when it's forced to, it rises up. And it breached the levees, and we were able to recover damages, interests, and attorney's fees because the owner of our property, the insured, the auto auction, had given more than his share to the public undertaking so that they wouldn't have to pay for the expensive boring underneath the 101 freeway. So the result, a nice $2.5 million from a state that was totally broke, all because we had taken the time to do the investment, to do the investigation. Both of these claims that I've just shown you had been written off as no subrogation recovery until we convinced them to just do a little bit of investing into the cause of the flooding. Now remember, cause of the flooding doesn't have to be as blatant as some of the things we've just uncovered. It could be, in the case of some of the hurricanes that hit Houston over the last few years, it can be a retention pond in which power goes out to a pump, and the retention pond overflows, allowing water to contribute to flooding on a nearby property. And of course, the defense was act of God. The defense was these cars would have been flooded anyway. But the difference here is that we were able to show, using science, that the additional water added by the failure of the neighboring property to keep the pump running actually was the straw that broke the camel's back. Because with science, with hydrology and hydraulics and HEC-RAS studies, we'll talk about those briefly, we were able to do a computer module that showed what the flooding would have been like with the pump working and what it would have been like without the pump working. So when you want to investigate potential natural disasters, you want to make sure to get statements not only from the insureds and potential interested parties and employees, but also from neighbors. As you can see, neighbors play a key role because water knows no boundaries. Country clubs which have disturbed the topography or nearby construction are always suspects. When you have water damage or you have a great deal of rain, but you have just one or two pieces of property that are heavily damaged, usually that's because of the act of man, not the act of God. And that's what we're looking for, the man-made acts of events, omissions, errors, mistakes, that contribute to natural disasters, like the bank building when the heavy winds came, failure to have appropriate lightning arresters, and things of that nature. Obtain the right experts. If you have a question about experts, send me an email through the website. Just tell me what your situation is, what your venue is, and almost as important, what the dollar amount is that you're looking to recover. And we will find an expert that we from a database we've compiled of over 25,000 experts throughout the country over the last 28 years. They are segregated and searchable electronically, not only by discipline, hydraulics, hydrology, mechanical engineering, electrical, but they are also segregated by their price. Are they a Cadillac expert charging high fees but carrying great notes and authority with them, or are they I used to say Hyundai, but Hyundais are actually good cars now. I don't know, Hugos. The cheaper experts who a smaller file will bear the cost of investing in them. We want to visit the scene and talk to the neighbors. Photographs are absolutely essential. You can hire third-party investigating vendors to go out and do some of this investigation for you, but if you have any significance, if there's any chance that there's going to be 6 figures or, God forbid, 2 commas in your reserve figure, I would certainly urge you, and this isn't the Matthiesen Wickert self-employment pitch here, get subrogation counsel involved. Some of the things that can be done early on cannot be done after the passage of even a short amount of time when you're dealing with natural disasters. So speaking specifically as to floods, let's talk just briefly about some of the science that we'll be dealing with. I'm not going to get too technical, because I can't. That's why I hire experts. And this seminar is actually one that I have jointly given with a noted hydrologist and he does an excellent job, better than I can do. But a flood is basically too much water in too short of a period of time for a given structure. Now, what do I mean by structure? You can look at the photograph, and you can see man-made items in this photograph. You see a tree. That's not man-made. You see water. That's not man-made. But you see buildings. You see, well, you can't see the topography, but swales and alterations in grading and other structures. Structures are any number of features associated with water flow, such as river and stream channels, culverts, pipes, dams, spillways, catch basins, swales, and floods come in all shapes and sizes. A couple examples here. This is a suburban example of flooding when the flow of water exceeds the capacity of a stream channel. Now, the culvert, which you can't see, is actually under the road, and the posts that you see up are the posts of a guardrail. So somewhere under there is a culvert which, through neglect, had been become obstructed, wasn't cleaned, and there was no maintenance done to it. And this is an after shot. The water, as you can tell, was much, much higher than this, causing some significant damages to a piece of property that we subrogated for. The three factors of a flood, and these are three things that you'll want to remember, retain in terms of the science. But the three factors of a flood are the storm event. This is the act of God. We cannot subrogate for an act of God. But in addition to the storm event, there is a watershed. The watershed is an area, a basin in which all of the water that falls, all of the rain that falls within that given boundary, that watershed, will accumulate and stay within that watershed and eventually drain somewhere. It can be ascertained. Often the watershed is delineated by natural features, but often the watershed is also affected by man-made actions. So storm event is not man-made, but a watershed can be altered by man. Now, just altering a watershed in and of itself doesn't give rise to a cause of action for damage as a result of water damage or flooding. But the third element is the structure. And an urban example of flooding from a small amount of rainfall occurs when the volume of water exceeds the capacity of catch basins and storm sewer systems. Those are structures that were either A, not designed to handle a foreseeable amount of rainfall, or B, were not maintained, or C, both, all of the above. So the first factor, now we're going to look at each of these real quick here. The storm event is something that can be random in intensity. Storms and precipitation are, for the most part, random, and they're not of the same intensity and durations. In order to evaluate and design structures, hydrologists and engineers have established a standard storm events with defined amounts of precipitation and defined distribution of precipitation over time for a given storm event. So common storm return intervals, and I told you we might get a little science here, but common storm return intervals are noted along with examples of rainfall amounts for an indicated storm event, and hydrologists can then assign risk. Structures with more assigned risk, such as dams, are designed to the more intense, less frequent, larger storm events because of human health and safety factors. But we are seeing more and more that municipalities that used to design for 15-year storms are requiring designs for 50 and 100-year storms. Is that good? Well, yes, it's good for society because people are protected from the larger storms. But it's bad for those municipalities who say, well, we're just not going to spend the money right now. I think designing for a 15-year storm is okay, and we'll just suffer the consequences. Well, depending on your jurisdiction and venue, there may be some liability that attaches if there's a 100-year storm, which I mentioned is a 1% chance of occurring, or a 50-year storm, which has a 2% chance of occurring. So it's a little bit oversimplistic to say the 100-year storm comes on average every 100 years, and the 25-year storm comes on average every 25 years. It's really calculated a little backwards, but I'll leave that for the experts. The second factor we talked about was the watershed. And there are 4 factors within a watershed that determine how much water runs off during a storm event: the size and area, the land surface slopes, surface cover, and the surface conditions. Now, you go, so what? Well, all of these things have to be taken into consideration anytime you're doing construction. And we know what kind of fly-by-night construction companies can be out there making major changes to land surface slopes, land surface cover, surface conditions, and by simple laws of physics, once the water falls, once the act of God is complete, that water has to go somewhere, and people who haven't done their homework or taken precautions can find that they are now affecting their neighbors in drastically different ways. So when you have what seems like an act of God flood loss, it's often good to look at the watershed and look for what man-made changes have occurred. Here's an example of a watershed. The heavy blue line is the boundary of the watershed itself. Any water that falls within that blue line is going to find its way to a common river or stream and is going to exit that sub-basin or that basin or that watershed somewhere. The thin blue lines are sub-watersheds or sub-basins. And all of America is covered with maps like this. Anywhere you have a loss, we can get a map like this. Usually these are topographical, but they also reflect changes that are man-made. And rainfall within a watershed boundary, such as the blue line, or even within a sub-basin, which is the thin blue line, runs off as sure as gravity pulls things down to a specific location. And we can calculate those things. Now, the third factor we talked about was structures. And this is where we want to focus a little bit and look at some examples of structures that are associated with the flow of water. And there are 2 types of structures. There are natural structures, and there are man-made structures. Now, the man-made or the natural structures, stream beds, river beds, ponds, ditches, etc., can't really be changed, but people responsible for construction or preventing against flooding have to take into consideration that stream beds and river beds change. There is the natural changing of a riverbed to the point where it may be in one place 1 year, and 5 years, 10 years later, it's moved a considerable distance. And that meandering of the riverbeds and stream beds has to be taken into consideration as well. But it's the man-made structures that we're mainly concerned about. The dams, the spillways, channels, culverts, storm basins, catch basins, and gutters. It's a little simplistic to say, well, okay, if we have a flood loss, we just better go check and make sure that all the culverts were not clogged. When I was in college, one of the jobs I had was working for a highway department, and it was a 21-year-old's dream. I got to drive around in a 4-wheel drive Bronco with a radio and a pitchfork, and my only job during inclement weather was to drive around and make sure that culverts, storm sewers, and catch basins were clear of debris. So there's an example of proactive government action and a plan of maintenance for when there's inclement weather that some municipalities either don't do or neglect to do when they have storms. And those are things that can be looked into for purposes of subrogation. Here's a couple examples. We have an example of an earthen dam here. If development causes more water than the dam is designed to control, you have runoff that overtops the dam. And when this structure is built for, and you can see the water up on the upper left up here, right there, you can see that there's water there that's being retained by this dam. But if you then have, excuse me, action that's being taken on neighboring property over here, you may have modifications to the natural topography or structures which are created, which will increase the runoff to this pond, which will result in this earthen dam being overtopped. And to what extent it's overtopped, I guess depends on how much water flows into it, but you can then blame any downstream flooding on the neighbors here, even though this dam might not have been high enough to handle the water that was eventually poured into it. So those are some things that you can look into. Now I'm going to get rid of my drawer, and here's an example of another type of structure. Excuse me. This is an example of a spillway at a small dam. Now, if this spillway isn't sized correctly, you will have flooding. This combined just over the top of that hill in the background there was a nursing home, and this happened in a part of our country that is about as close to the Beverly Hillbillies before they moved to Beverly Hills as I've ever seen. I mean, it was just truly amazing. But the nursing home became flooded, and there was even a death as a result of, I forgot what it was, a short circuit or something. But I was mainly interested, at least my client was, in the property damage. We were able to show that the incorrectly sized spillway combined with a culvert that ran under, and this is common, a railroad trestle combined to cause the flooding. They had had increased flooding over the years, and it turns out that the railroad had no design plan of maintenance whatsoever, and they eventually left their trestle culvert simply clog up, and there was no drainage at all. And of course, if you can envision a railroad track, you know it's elevated, and actually acts like a little dam. So as railroads crisscross the country, they do have an obligation to not only put up crossbucks and flashing lights in certain situations and warn against intersection collisions with their trains, they also have the added obligation of making sure that they don't alter the nearby topography to the point where it's going to cause flooding. So those things have to be taken into consideration, and they clearly did. They just didn't maintain it properly. Now here's an example of a culvert and a paved path that has been washed away. If you look at the pipe that's crossing that stream there, that pipe used to run under a bridge which crossed this stream. And the banks have been temporarily stabilized here in this photograph until long-term repairs are made. But the culvert, a culvert, that the one that you see downwind a little bit there upstream, is the one that actually caused some of the flooding. So this caused some property damage, not significant, but also the loss of the bridge and some other things that were eventually paid for in an insurance claim. Here's an example of a large culvert. This is actually 8 foot by 10 foot, so I'm 6'7". You can imagine, even if I'm standing in that entryway, I've still got 1.5 foot almost above my head. That shows you how large that opening was. But the normal flow, and it was designed large for a reason, the normal flow uses very little of its capacity, but because of the design and the topography on the other side of this hill, there had to be a lot of excess capacity designed into this, which was reserved for those infrequent occasions when you had the large water losses. Is this over-designed? No, it's not. It's a story that there was some property damage here that had more to do with another structure. But you know, I was vacationing with my family down in Arizona, and we were taking a horseback ride, and we ended up getting off the horses and walking down into these slot canyons. And the guide was explaining to us, and this was dry and hot, and we're sweaty, and he kept warning us that we may have to get out quickly if there's a sudden flood that comes by. And I was like, what? A sudden flood? Well, what happens is Slot Canyon, which was 6 feet wide and 20 feet tall, and there are only certain points when you can get in and out of it. If it's raining 20 miles away, that water tends to build up, and just like a pipe that gets narrower and narrower, causing the pressure to rise and the water to increase more rapidly, it wasn't long before he said, let's get out. And of course we listened, we got out, and not long after that came this huge rush of water, almost filling up the entire canyon. And then some 15, 20 minutes later, we started to get some overcast skies, and eventually it rained. Well, that's a fundamental property of water and the transfer, the hydraulics with respect to water that I would never have even thought of. But yet that guide had a duty to warn us of that, and thank goodness he did. So it's just another example of how designing against water damage is really something that needs to be taken seriously, and when it's not, there is subrogation potential. Here's another example of a culvert. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes, but in this example, someone has placed a screen across the culvert. A lot of times landowners do this because they don't like junk floating onto their property and obstructing their stream further down, which then can cause some topping of the banks on their property. But in this example, this screen eventually led to some flooding because the debris totally clogged up. It's clear now, but it totally clogged up the culvert, and the water topped the culvert itself. So you can reduce the capacity of flow for the culvert. This is a human example of what happens naturally, say when beavers are in the area. This is essentially human beavers that cause that type of condition. Now, here's clearly something we recognize. It's a typical catch basin grate. The water must flow through the grate to enter the catch basin, and it's carried away by the storm sewer system. If there's debris or leaves, trash, whatever, and it covers and blocks the grate, or if the storm catch basin isn't maintained properly, remember me in college, it can fill with sediment, and the water will have nowhere to go. So I show you this for a reason. I want to show you another picture of a culvert in just a moment, but this all leads to answer the question, what causes a flood? What causes a flood are changes in any one of the three factors we've talked about: the storm event, the watershed, or the structures. We are normally trained to look only at the first event, the storm event. We look frequently. You see this in the papers. I see this in many subrogation files that come across my desk. Oh, we had some flooding. The water entered the building. We had to do, mold remediation. And really, there's no subrogation here because there was 7 inches of rain that fell within a 2-hour period. All right. So, act of God. That's the first thing that comes to mind. And remember, there's 3 factors: storm event, watershed, and structures. We focus on the first event, the one we cannot change, and we forget to look at the other 2. I want to also mention that one of the common mistakes that we make as subrogation professionals is we go to the newspaper. And how do I know it? Because I see them in the files that I receive. Oh, here's a subrogation file, Gary. What do you think of this? Unfortunately, there's 7.5 inches of rain, and a short period of time. I don't think that we're going to be able to overcome the act of God defense here. What sells newspapers? Sensation. And if they were to say that, oh, we had some, a little bit of rain here, it wouldn't cause much of a hoopla. But if they can somehow find somewhere where there was 7.5 inches of rain in a short period of time, you then can say, wow, we had a newsworthy event that has to be reported on. So anytime you go to the newspapers for accuracy on how much rain fell in a given local geographical area, chances are you're going to be misled. Understand that there are things called microbursts where you will have a large amount of water fall within a quarter square mile area, and just a half mile away you'll have 1/10 that amount of rain. That's just the way the acts of God work. And meteorologists can explain this better than I can. But now you are considering the fact that even within a given storm event, you have to really look for local reporting on rain gauges. Now, keep in mind the neighbor in the Kenosha, Wisconsin Subaru loss that I went over to, and he kept detailed rain gauges for the last 60 years that I was able to extrapolate from and use as evidence, and the judge readily said that would be admissible. In that case, we were able to show. But if you have 7.5 inches of rain in a short period of time, a quarter mile away, that water has to go somewhere. So now we're talking about not simply the storm event, but we're talking about the watershed conditions as well. We're talking about rural to suburban, rural to urban changes. If there is a significant amount of snow on the ground, for example, and a large storm event occurs, the problem can be compounded due to the water from the melting snow. So you may have had 3 inches of rain, but there was additional water that came from melting snow. And I've had cases in which there was a sudden thaw, and somebody had been piling up snow from their parking lot, and that snow melted and exacerbated a condition which caused some minor flooding. And that is something that's foreseeable. If the ground is frozen or saturated from previous rain events, a portion of the water from a storm event is not able to infiltrate into the ground, and therefore this increases the amount of water that runs off and can contribute to the flooding. So watershed conditions also play a role. But of course, we get to the man-made factor, that of structures. This is where most of the subrogation potential is hidden. This is where the investment comes in. You can have settlement of soil. You can have construction errors, damage or deterioration of water control structures, blocked or restricted types of grates and catch basins and things like that. And you can also have, and this is very common but not easily detected and often hidden, are design errors. I had a case involving multiple homes which flooded out in a large subdivision in which the general contractor hired a sub to do all of the grading. And what he did, because he wasn't getting paid, is he did the grading on the interior of the lots, but didn't grade the lot lines. What that caused was something that the papers referred to as 50 or 60 different duck ponds, which then, of course, caused flooding to the partially constructed homes, collapses of the basements, and you can hear the cha-ching, cha-ching of the damages that would resulted from that. But there were some design errors and some construction errors that were done in those situations which contributed. Now, remember the catch basin I showed you earlier. Here's a picture of that same catch basin, which is partially obstructed. So the water control capability of this catch basin is going to be disproportionately restricted based on the amount of sediment that's there. And of course, the next time water comes, it's going to bring more sediment. So you're going to have almost a complete closure of this catch basin in a very short amount of time. What you see here, this photo was taken after the loss of a Kentucky business. The significance of this photo in causing the flood loss we handled will be evident by the next slide, which shows the exact same location after we took a shovel to it. And you can see what's hidden there. Now, this is something that your investigation third party would never find on his own. You almost always have to go look at some plans or have an expert look at the master plan to determine if there's any problems. Here's a similar culvert to the one we saw before that is being obstructed, and you can see how that happens. Here's an example of a construction error. This is a large waterway opening here, and what they did is they put in a new bridge, but they lowered it and put in big steel girders, which basically limited the amount of water that can flow through here. And so when they had a high rain on the opposite side of this highway, or the street rather, there was flooding on the other side, which was attributable and eventually paid for by the construction company's insurance company. So we've talked about all these things. We've looked at the assessment of a flood. The important thing is you can simulate a flood. I'm going to move up here because we got a late start. You can review construction records, as-built drawings. This is all part of the investigation. Your experts will define the existing conditions, check the capacity of the structures, and ultimately we'll do one of these methods. There's several different methods for actually reconstructing flood losses, and what was really sweet about the California loss that we took from the state of California is the fact that we had to show that the flooding of the property was not simply due to the overbreaching of the levees, that it was due to the loss of the end values, it was due to the sedimentation, due to the vegetation, and we did this easily by taking those laser shots of the water levels right after the loss, hint, hint, and then they plugged them into something called, at that time it was a HEC 2 study, now it's a HEC RAS study, which takes into account bridges, channel design, sediments, and on a computer, we played back for the court a video of the actual flood occurring. No one witnessed it, but we were able to, with science and hydraulics, show exactly what happened, what flooded where, and the key to this was that we showed water flowing in to the insured's property as a result of the confluence of two waterways where they made that 90-degree turn, remember, that right-hand turn that water doesn't like to take, rather than it simply overflowing the levees which were on our insured's own property. And that carried the day and allowed us to recover on an inverse condemnation claim with the state of California. Here's a cross view of the HEC RAS simulation. The dots represent the river bottom. I'm going to show you real quick. If this was brand new, here's what the river bottom would look like. So you can now see where the sedimentation has filled in, and you can scientifically calculate what the neglect to that waterway system was and how it contributed to the flooding. Here's a similar one with more data. Here's an overview of it's a HEC RAS graph of a river in a floodplain. You can look, you're looking down at it like an airplane, and the red lines represent the river. If you can see that, how small it is. The black lines are the cross sections where the data was used. The green lines represent the flooded areas. So again, experts are heavily relied on in these areas, and it's not just flooding. We're a little heavy on flooding because the majority of natural disasters that I see are, of course, flooding cases. But that's the presentation. I'm going to check to see if we have some questions. If not, I would urge anyone who has questions to submit them via the website. I'll show you real briefly here. Oh, actually, I did check. I didn't have it up. Never mind, I apologize. But we do file reviews for free. We're happy to look at any flood losses. There's a lightning article that I think we have online that will go into some great detail on lightning cases. My goodness, isn't lightning an act of God? If anything is, then the answer is yes. But of course, there are man-made things that can prevent against fires and losses as a result of lightning. Even hail, if you think about it, if you're involved in dealerships, there are a lot of items out there that can quickly be pulled over the tops of vehicles to help prevent against hail damage, and sometimes they don't work like they should, and you may have subrogation potential then. So even in areas where you might think the act of God is going to rule, there may be some third-party potential there. So I thank you for attending. I certainly welcome your questions. I apologize for the technical difficulties that we had, and I urge you to look forward to December 16th. Mark your calendars. Russell Whittle, one of the leading MSA's Medicare set-aside and Medicare experts in the country, will join me, and we will present a live webinar entitled Medicare Set-Asides and the Subrogation Professional. Until then, I thank you for attending and look forward to working with you. Thanks.